On the 7th of February, 1968, a lawyer knocked on the door of a small rented house in Beverly Hills. Nobody answered. He looked through the window, and what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. A man was sitting on the floor of the bedroom, propped upright against the wall, fully dressed, head tilted slightly, eyes still open. He looked at first glance like a man who had simply sat down to think for a moment. He was not thinking. He had been dead for hours. His name was Nick Adams. He was 36 years old. He had been nominated for an Academy Award. He had been a close friend of James Dean and carried the memory of that friendship with him. He was, according to those who knew him best, a close and loyal friend of Elvis Presley. And on that afternoon in February, in a quiet bedroom on a quiet street, his life ended in a way that has never, not in 1968, not now, more than half a century later, been fully explained. The official coroner's ruling was, and remains, undetermined. Not accident. Not suicide. Undetermined. Which is a very strange thing for the state of California to write on the death certificate of a working Hollywood actor. And that is where our story begins. Not with the death. We will come back to that quiet bedroom, and we will come back to it carefully. But with a boy. A small, wiry boy with dark eyes, born in a coal town in Pennsylvania, who wanted, more than almost anything else a child has ever wanted, to be somebody. To be seen. To be remembered. So sit back with me for a while. Get comfortable. Because the story of Nick Adams is not just the story of a Hollywood tragedy. It is the story of an entire vanished America. It is the story of coal dust and movie sets, of friendships that mattered, of a marriage that almost worked, and of a mystery that some people believe was never really a mystery at all, and other people believe was something else entirely. We will look at all of it. We will separate what is known from what is only whispered. And by the end, I think you will feel, as I do, that you have finally met the man behind the name. His real name, the one his mother gave him, was Nicholas Aloysius Adamshock. He was born on the 10th of July, 1931, in the town of Nanticoke, Pennsylvania. If you have never heard of Nanticoke, do not feel bad. Most Americans have not. It is a small place in the anthracite coal region of northeastern Pennsylvania, tucked into the Wyoming Valley, about 10 miles southwest of Wilkes-Barre. In the 1930s, when Nick was born, it was a mining town. That is not a description, that is an identity. Everything in Nanticoke, everything, was organized around the mine. The men worked in the mine, the women fed the men who worked in the mine, the churches prayed for the men who worked in the mine. And the boys, from the time they could walk, understood that one day the mine would be waiting for them, too. Nick's father was one of those men. Peter Adamshock was an immigrant from the old country. His family roots were Ukrainian and Polish, depending on which document you read, and which border was standing in Europe on which particular Tuesday. Peter went down into the earth every morning before dawn, and he came back up in the evening with a fine gray dust in his hair, in his ears, in the creases around his eyes, and under his fingernails. That last detail, the coal under the fingernails, is one that Nick himself mentioned in later interviews. He remembered it as a child. He remembered that his father's hands never came fully clean. No matter how hard Peter scrubbed at the kitchen sink, the coal had gone into him. It was in him. Nick's mother was named Catherine. She was the anchor of the household. She kept a small wooden house on a small side street clean, warm, and, when the wages allowed it, fed. There was a younger brother, Andrew. There was, according to family memory, another child who did not survive infancy, something that was, in a coal town in the 1930s, tragically not uncommon. Catherine carried that grief the way women of her generation carried grief, which is to say quietly and without complaint, and while continuing to make breakfast every morning. Money was tight. Money was always tight. When the mines slowed during the worst years of the Depression, money was more than tight. It was a kind of quiet, permanent hunger that lived in the corners of the house. Nick, in later years, would talk about this only rarely. He was not a man who liked to dwell on hard times, but when he did mention it, he mentioned specific small things. The way his mother would stretch one chicken across a whole week. The way winter coats were handed down, not just between brothers, but between families, up and down the block. The way a new pair of shoes was an event. Now, here is something important about Nick Adams that we need to establish right at the beginning, because it will explain almost everything that comes later. From the time he was very small, he was a performer. Not in a professional sense, in a survival sense. He was the boy who told the jokes. He was the boy who did the imitations of the teacher. He was the boy who, when the family sat around the small radio in the evening listening to comedy shows out of New York, would repeat the lines afterwards in perfect imitation of the voices, until his mother laughed and told him gently to stop showing off. Except she did not really want him to stop. Because when Nick was showing off, the small house was, for a little while, a brighter place. And Catherine Adamshock understood that. There is a story that Nick himself told in a few interviews later in life. I cannot verify every detail of it independently, and Nick was, we should be honest, a man who liked a good story, and who sometimes polished his stories to a high shine. But the outline of it is, by all accounts, real. When he was around 6 or 7 years old, he was cast as an angel in the Christmas nativity play at his church. He had one line. He was supposed to walk out onto the small wooden stage, spread his arms, and announce the birth of the Savior. He walked out, he spread his arms, and in the moment, in front of every person in the parish, in front of his mother and his father and his brother, he forgot the line. Any other child would have frozen, or cried, or run off stage. Nick did something else. He looked out at the audience, he smiled, and he improvised. He said something, in the character of the angel, that got a laugh. And the pastor, standing in the wings, waited for the laugh to finish, and then quietly fed him the correct line, and the play went on. Nick would tell this story in later years, and he would say, half joking, that it was the moment he decided to become an actor. But listen to what is really inside that story. A small boy, faced with public failure, chose instead to make people laugh. He chose performance over shame. He chose the reaction of the crowd over the fear inside himself. That was 6 or 7 years old. That was the entire template of the man he would become. Now, we need to talk about the family name for a moment, because it is going to matter. Adamshock. Peter Adamshock did not always use that exact spelling. Some documents show it as Adamshock, without the C. In Nanticoke, it did not matter. It was a Polish-Ukrainian coal country name in a town full of Polish-Ukrainian coal country names. But it would matter later. It would matter in Hollywood. Because Hollywood, in the 1950s, did not want an Adamshock. Hollywood wanted an Adams. And a boy who had been raised in a small wooden house full of the smell of coal dust and cabbage soup would, one day, become a young man walking down Sunset Boulevard with a shortened name, trying to convince the world that he had always been who he was pretending to be. We are not there yet. We are still in Nanticoke. When Nick was about 10 years old, the family made a decision that would change everything. Peter's health was beginning to fail. The mine was doing what the mine always did, patiently and without cruelty. The Adamshocks packed up what they had and moved east, to Jersey City, New Jersey. There, Peter took work in different industries, trying to escape the coal dust that had already, if we are being honest, become part of him. Nick finished his schooling in New Jersey. He graduated from Henry Snyder High School in Jersey City. And it was in that period, in his teenage years in the shadow of New York City, that a very specific idea began to grow in him. An idea that most boys have and abandon. He had it, and he did not abandon it. He wanted to be an actor. Not a stage actor exactly. He was thinking of the movies. This was the middle 1940s, moving into the late 1940s. The picture houses of the New York area were full every weekend, and Nick was in them. He watched everything. He studied faces. He studied the way actors held cigarettes, the way they leaned against door frames, the way they made a room feel a certain way just by walking into it. He particularly loved the tough young men of the era, Cagney, Bogart, later Brando when Brando arrived and blew the whole thing open. He practiced in mirrors. This is documented. Nick Adams, as a teenager, practiced expressions in the bathroom mirror of the small apartment his family shared. He practiced the tough guy. He practiced the wounded boy. He practiced the smile that comes just before a punch is thrown. His younger brother would sometimes catch him at it and would laugh, and Nick would get furious, because to Nick this was not play. This was serious training. For what, exactly, nobody in Jersey City could yet imagine. When he finished high school in the late 1940s, he did not go to college. There was no money for that, and even if there had been, Nick had other plans. He worked odd jobs, he saved every penny he could, and in 1950, at the age of 18, he did what tens of thousands of young Americans of his generation did. He got on a bus, and he headed west. The bus was a Greyhound. The ticket cost, if we account for the era, most of what he had. He rode across the country, sleeping upright, eating cheap sandwiches at bus station counters, and watching, through a dirty window, the whole of America unrolling backwards behind him. When he arrived in Los Angeles, he had, according to the account he later gave, almost nothing left in his pocket. He had a small suitcase, he had a change of clothes, he had a name he was already thinking of changing, and he had, most importantly, the absolute unshakable certainty that he was going to make it. Now, if you have never been young and broke and alone in Los Angeles, let me try to describe what that is like. Los Angeles is a city that does not notice you. It is not cruel exactly. It is simply enormous and warm and indifferent. You can walk down Sunset Boulevard on a Tuesday afternoon in the sunshine and understand with terrible clarity that not one single person passing you has any reason to remember your face. That is the atmosphere Nick Adams walked into as an 18-year-old boy from Nanticoke. He did what everybody does. He got a room. Actually, he got several rooms, in a series of cheap boarding houses, each one worse than the one before, as his money ran out. He got small jobs. He worked as a busboy. He worked at a gas station. He worked at one point at a hamburger stand, and in between shifts, he read the trade papers, and he went to open casting calls, and he learned, slowly and painfully, how the town actually worked. Here we should pause, because the mythology of 1950s Hollywood tends to smooth over the reality of what it was like to be an unknown young actor in that town at that time. Let me try to be honest with you about it. It was hard. It was brutally, grindingly hard. There were thousands of young men in Los Angeles at any given moment who looked roughly the way Nick Adams looked, dark-haired, wiry, intense, hungry. The casting couches were real. The exploitation was real. The parties where a young unknown could either meet the right person or be quietly ruined by the wrong one were absolutely real. Nick navigated all of it. How he navigated it exactly is one of the things we do not entirely know, because he was not a man who wrote it down. But he survived. And more than surviving, he began, slowly, to get work. Very small work at first, uncredited walk-ons, extra work, a face in a crowd scene. Then, in 1952, when he was still just 20 years old, he got his first real screen credit in a film called Somebody Loves Me. A tiny part. But his name, his new name, the shortened one, Nick Adams, appeared in a movie poster for the first time. For a boy from Nanticoke who had only a few years earlier been imitating Cagney in a bathroom mirror in Jersey City, that credit was everything. He kept a copy of the poster. According to people who knew him then, he kept it for years. And here is where the story starts to move faster. because in 1953 the United States Army sent Nick a letter. The Korean War was on. He was drafted. He served for a period in the Coast Guard, which was itself a kind of theater. He was assigned to entertainment and morale work, where his ability to perform, to imitate, to make a room full of tired men laugh actually turned out to be useful for the first time in a professional context. When he was discharged, he came back to Los Angeles. He was a little older now, a little harder, and this time the town was ready to notice him. Because in 1954, Nick Adams walked onto a Warner Brothers soundstage, and he met a young man from Indiana who was about to change everything. For himself, for American cinema, and quietly, for Nick. The young man's name was James Dean. And what happened next, in the 2 short years that followed, would either make Nick Adams for the rest of his short life, or break him, or, as some who knew both men later suggested, do both at the same time. Let me tell you about that friendship, and about what came after it. Because it matters. It matters more than any single other thing in the story of Nick Adams, and it is where the first of the great mysteries of his life begins. The Warner Brothers lot in 1954 was one of the most extraordinary places on Earth. If you had walked through the main gate on Barham Boulevard on a weekday morning in that year, you would have passed, in the space of about 20 minutes, more famous faces than most people see in a lifetime. The commissary at lunchtime was a kind of small, air-conditioned universe. Established stars sat at certain tables, directors sat at other tables, and around the edges, at the smallest tables closest to the kitchen, sat the young ones, the contract players, the hopefuls, the boys and girls who were, on any given afternoon, one phone call away from either a career or a bus ticket home. Nick Adams sat at those edges. He had signed a contract with Warner Brothers, not a leading contract, a working contract. The kind that meant they could use him in whatever picture needed a young, tough face on a given week, and he was obligated to show up and deliver. It was not glamorous, but for a boy from Nanticoke, it was a paycheck, and it was an ID card that let him through the gate, and it was, most importantly, a place where he could be seen by people who mattered. And it was in that commissary, at one of those small tables at the edge of the room, that Nick Adams met James Dean. Now, I want to be careful here, because the friendship between Nick Adams and James Dean is one of the most mythologized relationships in 1950s Hollywood, and a lot of what has been written about it over the past 70 years is, to put it politely, more atmosphere than fact. So let me tell you what we actually know, and let me be very clear when I move from what is documented into what is only suggested. That is important, and I want us to do this honestly together. What is documented is this. In 1954, James Dean was cast in a film called East of Eden, directed by Elia Kazan. Around the same period, both Dean and Nick Adams were part of the loose, floating community of young contract actors around the Warner lot. They met. They became friends. How close that friendship was exactly is the subject we will come to in a moment. But the friendship itself is real. It is confirmed by multiple people who were there, by photographs, and by the simple fact that when Rebel Without a Cause was cast in the summer of 1955, Nick Adams was in it. Let me pause on that film for a moment, because it deserves it. Rebel Without a Cause, directed by Nicholas Ray, released in October of 1955, is one of the defining films of American youth culture. It is the film that fixed James Dean forever in the imagination of the world. The red jacket, the switchblade, the terrible, tender vulnerability of that young face. And in that film, alongside Dean and Natalie Wood and Sal Mineo, there is a small, sharp-featured young actor playing a member of the gang. He has scenes. He has lines. He is not the star. He is not close to the star. But he is there, in the frame, in one of the most watched films of the decade. And that young actor is Nick Adams. His role was a supporting one, a member of the group of teenagers who orbit around Dean's character. It was not a big part. But being in that film, at that moment, standing on that set, sharing scenes with James Dean at the height of his brief and blinding career, meant everything to Nick. He talked about it for the rest of his life. Not in a boastful way, in a wondering way. The way a man talks about the single luckiest room he ever walked into. Now, here is where we need to move carefully, because we are moving from the documented into the disputed. There is a story, widely repeated over the decades, that Nick Adams was called in after James Dean's death to dub several of Dean's lines in the film Giant, which was still in post-production when Dean was killed. I want to be honest with you about this story. Parts of it are almost certainly true. It is a documented fact that some of Dean's dialogue in Giant had to be redone in post-production because his original recordings were unusable in certain scenes. It is also a fact that at least one actor was brought in to help with that work. Whether Nick Adams was the primary voice used, or whether he contributed only a small amount, or whether his involvement has been exaggerated over the years by biographers, is honestly still debated. What we can say fairly is this. Nick himself, in later interviews, spoke about being brought onto that project after Dean's death. He described it as one of the most emotionally difficult things he had ever done, speaking into a microphone in the voice of a friend who was, only a few weeks earlier, alive. Whether every technical detail of that story is accurate, I cannot tell you with certainty, but the emotional truth of it, the fact that Nick carried Dean's death with him as a personal wound for the rest of his life, is not in dispute. And that death, when it came suddenly. On the afternoon of the 30th of September, 1955, James Dean was driving his silver Porsche 550 Spyder north on Route 466 in Central California, on his way to a race in Salinas. At a rural intersection near a place called Cholame, another driver turned left in front of him. The impact was catastrophic. Dean was pronounced dead a short time later. He was 24 years old. Rebel Without a Cause had not yet been released. Giant was still in post-production. In a single afternoon, in a single second on a quiet California road, one of the most promising careers in the history of American film ended. Nick Adams heard the news that same evening. He was 24 years old himself. What he felt in that moment, we can only imagine. But we know something about what he did in the days and weeks that followed, because people who were around him then have talked about it. He became, for a time, quiet in a way that was very unlike him. He drank a little more. He stayed later at the lot. He was seen, more than once, sitting alone in the Warner Brothers commissary, at the small edge table where he and Dean had once sat, doing nothing in particular, just sitting. Now, I want to address something directly, because if I do not, someone will bring it up in the comments, and I would rather we talked about it honestly and openly, together. Over the decades since Nick Adams' own death, there has been persistent speculation, in books, in articles, and more recently in podcasts and documentaries, that the friendship between Nick Adams and James Dean was more than a friendship, that there was, or may have been, a romantic dimension to it. I want to be very clear about how I'm going to handle this, because it matters. There is no confirmed documentary evidence that Nick Adams and James Dean were ever in a romantic relationship. Not a letter, not a photograph, not a witnessed account from anyone who was actually there. What exists is speculation, offered mostly by writers working many decades after both men were dead and unable to be confirmed or denied by either of them. So I am not going to tell you that they were lovers, because I do not know that, and neither does anyone alive today. What I will tell you is that they were, by every account of every person who saw them together, extremely close. They were young. They were ambitious. They were, in the closed and pressurized world of Warner Brothers in the middle 1950s, two of the very few people who understood exactly what the other one was going through. And when one of them died, the other one grieved in a way that some people, at the time and since, have described as the grief of a man who had lost something more than an ordinary friend. That is as far as the honest record takes us. Everything past that line is guesswork, and I am not in the business of guessing about the private hearts of dead men. What I can tell you is that James Dean's death changed something in Nick Adams. It changed the trajectory of his career, and it may have changed something inside him that never fully healed. Because in the months and years after Dean's death, a strange thing began to happen. Nick Adams became, without exactly planning it, one of the primary keepers of the James Dean story. Fan magazines wanted interviews, reporters wanted anecdotes. What was Jimmy really like? What was his favorite meal? What did he say the last time you saw him? Nick was willing to talk. Some people later said he was too willing, that he traded on the connection, that he built pieces of his own early career on the fact of the friendship. There is probably some truth in that criticism. But there is also a simpler truth. Nick was one of the few young actors in Los Angeles who had actually known James Dean well, and Nick was, above all else, a man who understood how the industry worked. If the industry wanted to hear about Dean, Nick would talk about Dean. And in doing so, he kept, in a small way, his friend alive. The years after Dean's death were, for Nick, years of steady climbing. Not stardom, not yet, but steady, real, professional work. He appeared in Mr. Roberts in 1955, playing a small role alongside Henry Fonda, James Cagney, and Jack Lemmon. Think about that cast for a moment. A young man from a coal town, in his early 20s, in a picture with those three names. He appeared in Picnic, also in 1955, alongside William Holden and Kim Novak. He appeared in No Time for Sergeants in 1958 with Andy Griffith. He appeared in Teacher's Pet with Clark Gable. Clark Gable, the king himself. And Nick, at some point during that production, worked up the courage to actually have a proper conversation with Gable, who was, by every account, kind to him. Nick told that story for years afterward. He was becoming, by the late 1950s, one of those faces you recognized without necessarily knowing the name. He was working. He was getting invited to the parties. He was being seen with the right people. And he was, by all accounts, one of the hardest-working young men in the entire town. And then, in 1959, everything changed. Because that was the year Nick Adams became, for the first time, a leading man. Not in a movie, in a television series, and the series was called The Rebel. The Rebel was created by Andy Fenady and Irwin Kershner. It premiered on ABC in October of 1959, and it ran for 2 seasons, ending in 1961. The show was a Western, but it was a Western with a difference. It was set in the years immediately after the American Civil War. Its main character, played by Nick, was named Johnny Yuma. Johnny Yuma was a young former Confederate soldier roaming the post-war American West, carrying a sawed-off shotgun and a small private journal in which he wrote down what he saw and what he thought. He was, in other words, a walking metaphor for a certain kind of American loneliness. He was a young man who had lost his war, lost his home, lost his family, and was trying, on horseback, to find out who he was supposed to be now. The show featured a powerful theme song performed by Johnny Cash, the young singer from Arkansas. If you have never heard it, find it after we finish this. It is one of the great television themes of the era, and when it played, at the start of every episode, over shots of Nick Adams riding across a dusty American landscape in a Confederate cap, it announced, week after week, that a small, dark-eyed boy from Nanticoke, Pennsylvania, was at last the star of his own show. He gave everything to it. He was involved not just as an actor, but as a co-creator of the character. He wrote or contributed to several scripts. He argued with the network about the direction of the story. He wanted Johnny Yuma to be more than a Western hero. He wanted him to be a real, wounded, thinking young man. And to a remarkable extent, given the constraints of network television in the late 1950s, he got what he wanted. The Rebel is not a perfect show. Some of the episodes have not aged well. But at its best, it is one of the more thoughtful westerns of its era, and Nick Adams's performance in it is a real, sustained piece of work. For 2 full seasons, week after week, he carried a television show as its lead. He was, at last, the man in the middle of the frame. And it was during those years, at the very peak of his professional rise, that his personal life also, quietly, finally, began to look like the life he had always wanted. Because he met a young actress named Carol Nugent. And in 1959, they were married. Carol was, in many ways, everything Nick was not. Where he was intense, she was calm. Where he was ambitious to the point of restlessness, she was steady. She had been a working child actress, so she understood the industry from the inside, but she was not consumed by it in the way Nick was. When she met Nick, she saw, according to what she said in later interviews, both what he was and what he was afraid of being. And she chose, with her eyes fully open, to love him anyway. They built a life together. A daughter, Allison, was born in 1960. A son, Jeb Stewart, followed in 1961. And for a period of several years, in a small house on a quiet street in the San Fernando Valley, Nick Adams, the boy from the coal town, the young man from the boarding houses of Los Angeles, had what he had always wanted. He had a family of his own. He had children of his own. He had, for the first time in his life, a place where his name was simply Dad. Those who visited the house in those years describe scenes that are almost startling in their ordinariness. Nick in the backyard teaching Allison how to walk. Nick on the floor of the living room letting little Jeb climb across his back. Nick in the kitchen in the evening quietly helping Carol dry the dishes after dinner. It is a version of Nick Adams that the fan magazines never really printed because it did not sell magazines. But it was, by every honest account of the people who knew them, real. He was, in those years, a good husband. He was, by every account, a devoted and physically affectionate father, of a kind that his own upbringing had not really prepared him to be. He worked hard, he came home, he loved his family. And then, on top of everything else, in the autumn of 1963, the phone rang, and a voice on the other end of the line told him something he had been half dreaming about since he was 6 years old in a church nativity play in Nanticoke. He had been nominated for an Academy Award. The film was called Twilight of Honor. It had been released in the autumn of 1963. It starred Richard Chamberlain, who was, at that moment, one of the most famous young men in America because of the television series Dr. Kildare. The film was a courtroom drama, and Nick Adams played a supporting role, a young drifter accused of murder whose defense forms the center of the story. It was not a huge picture. It did not set the box office on fire. But Nick's performance in it, that raw, wounded, jangling performance of a young man cornered by circumstance, was recognized in a way that nothing else he had ever done had been recognized before. He was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. Now, I want you to try to imagine, for a moment, what that news must have felt like inside the small house in the valley. The boy from Nanticoke, the bathroom mirror imitator, the Greyhound bus passenger, the commissary boy at the small edge table. That boy, now a grown man of 32, sitting on a couch with his wife, holding a telephone, being told by somebody in an office somewhere that his name, his shortened, invented Hollywood name, was going to be read out loud on the stage at the Academy Awards. He campaigned for it. Let us be honest about that, too. Nick campaigned for that Oscar in a way that some people in the industry, at the time, thought was undignified. He took out advertisements. He asked friends to speak on his behalf. He worked the phones. This was, in 1963, still a slightly unusual thing to do. Today, of course, that kind of campaigning is completely normal. Every studio does it every year for every nominee. But in the industry culture of the early 1960s, there was still a lingering expectation that a nominee should sit back and appear modest and let the work speak for itself. Nick did not sit back. Nick could not sit back. He had wanted this his entire life, and so he pushed. The Academy Awards ceremony that year was held on the 13th of April, 1964, at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium. Nick attended with Carol. He wore a dark suit. He sat in the audience. And when the Best Supporting Actor category came up and the envelope was opened, the name that was read was not his. The winner was Melvyn Douglas for his performance in HUD. It was, by every objective measure, a completely deserved win. Melvyn Douglas was a giant of American film. His performance in HUD was masterful. There was no injustice in the result. And yet, for Nick Adams, sitting in that auditorium in his dark suit, listening to another man's name read out, something inside him, according to people who knew him well in the months afterward, did not quite recover. That is a hard thing to describe without sounding dramatic. Nick did not fall apart. He did not become bitter in any public way. He did not, after that night, stop working. In fact, he worked more. But the specific dream of a certain kind of validation, the dream that some part of him had been carrying quite literally since he was a small boy holding a Sears catalog in a coal town living room and looking at pictures of moving stars, that specific dream had not been fulfilled. He had come so close. He had been in the room. He had heard his own name read as a nominee, and he had not won. And for a certain kind of person, and Nick Adams was that kind of person, coming that close and not making it is, in some ways, harder than never having come close at all. The years after the Oscar nomination are, in the biography of Nick Adams, the years where the story begins to turn. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, in the way that a life sometimes turns without the person living it noticing at first. The parts he was offered began to change. He had thought, and reasonably so, that the nomination would open the doors to bigger films, better directors, more serious material. It did not, quite. The offers that came in were not, on the whole, the offers he had been hoping for. Some of them were fine, some of them were routine, and a growing number of them were coming from outside the United States entirely. Which is how, in 1965, Nick Adams ended up on a plane bound for Tokyo. The Japanese film studio Toho, which is the same studio that had, a decade earlier, released the original Godzilla, was in the middle of what we now call the golden age of the kaiju film, the giant monster film. Toho wanted, for reasons of international distribution, to include American actors in some of their productions, to make the films more marketable in the United States and Europe. Nick Adams's name came up. He was known in America. He had a recognizable television face from The Rebel. He was, importantly, willing to travel and willing to work. And so, in 1965, he flew to Tokyo to appear in a film called Frankenstein Conquers the World, and shortly afterward in another one called Invasion of Astro Monster, which is also known by its original Japanese title, and which featured, alongside Nick, a very fine Japanese actress named Kumi Mizuno. Now, I want to talk about the Japan chapter of Nick Adams's life, because it is one of the parts of his story that is most often either glossed over or sensationalized, and I would like us to try to look at it honestly. First, the facts. Nick did travel to Japan for these productions. He did work with Toho. He did film alongside Kumi Mizuno, who was by every account a warm and generous colleague. He was, by the reports of the Japanese crew who worked with him, unusually respectful and polite for an American actor of his era. He tried to learn small pieces of Japanese. He was interested in Japanese culture in a way that many of his American peers, dropped into Tokyo for a 2-month shoot, simply were not. He was, by every measurable Japanese account, a decent and hard-working guest. Second, the whispers. There has been persistent speculation in various biographies and articles over the decades that during his time in Japan, Nick Adams developed a personal attachment to Kumi Mizuno that went beyond professional friendship. I want to be direct with you about this, because I think you deserve directness. There is no publicly confirmed evidence that Nick and Kumi were ever in a romantic relationship. Kumi Mizuno herself, in the interviews she has given over the many decades since, has consistently described their relationship as a professional friendship. Whatever Nick may have felt privately, whatever he may have wished for privately, is not something that we, sitting here today, are entitled to declare as fact. So I will not. What I will say is that his time in Japan seems to have been, in an important way, restorative. He was, in Tokyo, no longer competing for the small edge tables of the Warner Brothers commissary. He was the visiting American star. He was treated with warmth and courtesy. He was, for the first time in years, at the center of the room. And by every account, he loved it. He came home to California. And when he came home, the American offers were still not what he had hoped they would be. He did more television work. He did some smaller films. He worked. He was always working. But something in the balance of his life was beginning, slowly, to tip. The house in the valley became, gradually, more tense. Not through any single dramatic event, through the small, accumulated weight of disappointment. Nick, when a role he had wanted did not come through, was not a man who could easily hide it. He would come home quiet. He would sit in a chair in the living room in the evening for longer than he used to. Carol, who had lived with him now for years, understood what those quiet evenings meant. She tried to reach him. Sometimes she succeeded, sometimes she did not. I want to be careful here because everything I'm about to describe about the last 2 years of the Addams marriage is, by necessity, a partial account. Marriages are private. Even in Hollywood, even under the glare of the fan magazines, what actually happens between two people inside their own home is known only to those two people. What we can say, from the public record and from what Carol herself said in the years afterward, is this. By 1966, the marriage was under strain. By 1967, that strain had become at times more than either of them could carry. Carol filed for divorce in the summer of 1967. The divorce was in progress, but it was not finalized at the time of Nick's death. That is an important detail, and we will come back to it. The children, Allison and Jeb, were young. Allison was 6, going on 7 in that period. Jeb was 5, going on 6. They knew, of course, in the way that children always know, that something in the house had changed. But their father, by every account, remained a devoted father in the way he had always been. He picked them up, he carried them, he read to them. He took them, on weekends when he had them, to the small pleasures that a father in 1967 Los Angeles could give small children. The beach, the pier, the ice cream stand, the drive up into the hills at sunset. That part of him, the part that had made a small, quiet home in the valley into an actual home, did not fail. Whatever else was breaking, that part did not break. Professionally, in 1967, Nick was still working. He appeared in several television shows. He filmed Fever Heat, a film about stock car racing, which was released in 1968. He was, according to friends, actively pursuing new projects. He was in discussion about roles. He was reading scripts. He was, by every visible sign, a man who was planning to keep going. There is one detail from this last year of his life that I want to mention, because it is one of those small facts that people who study his story tend to hold on to. He was, in the last months of 1967 and the first weeks of 1968, in the middle of a legal dispute over back payments related to his work. It was not a scandalous dispute. It was the kind of business dispute that happens in the entertainment industry all the time. But he was owed money. He was pursuing it. And there is a strong indication from the people who spoke to him in those last weeks that he was expecting a check. He was expecting funds. He was, in other words, planning for a future that was going to have money in it. That matters, and we will come back to why it matters when we come back to that quiet bedroom in Beverly Hills. Now, before we do come back to that bedroom, I want to give you one more piece of context because it is important for understanding the whole shape of the man in his last months. In the summer and autumn of 1967, Nick Adams was, by every account, sober, or nearly so, working, seeing his children, and according to at least one close friend interviewed years later, telling people that he was going to write a book specifically about Hollywood, about the people he had known, about the things he had seen. Now, I want to be very careful with this because the story about Nick Adams writing a Hollywood tell-all book is one of the pieces of his biography that has, over the years, been used to fuel a lot of speculation about the circumstances of his death. Let me tell you what is actually documented, and let me tell you what is not. What is documented is that in the last year of his life, Nick spoke, in the presence of at least a small number of friends, about wanting to write a book. What is not documented is the existence of a manuscript. No manuscript of a Nick Adams tell-all book has ever been produced, found, or verified. If it existed, nobody has publicly seen it. If it did not exist, then it was, at most, an idea he was talking about. The kind of idea that many working actors in Hollywood, in every generation, talk about in the evenings without ever actually writing a word. So when you hear, as you sometimes do, that Nick Adams was murdered because he was about to publish a book that would have exposed Hollywood secrets, I need you to understand that this is speculation. It is not established fact. There is no manuscript. There is only the reported memory of a few friends that in his last months, Nick was talking about writing something. That is a very different thing from actually writing it. And I would rather be honest with you about that distinction than sell you a mystery I cannot back up. Which brings us, finally, to the 7th of February, 1968. To that quiet street in Beverly Hills, to that small rented house, and to a lawyer standing on a front porch in the middle of an ordinary California afternoon, knocking on a door that no one was going to answer. The house was on a small street in a residential neighborhood. Nick had been renting it in the months since the separation from Carol. He was living there alone. The children stayed with Carol at their family home and visited their father on the arranged days. That morning, the 7th of February, Nick had had appointments. He had been in touch on the previous day and evening with several people, friends, business associates, his lawyer, Irvin Roeder. There was, on the morning of the 7th, a meeting scheduled at the house with Roeder. Nick did not show up for the meeting in the sense of opening the door. Roeder waited. He tried the door. He looked through the window. And through that window he saw what he described afterwards as the most disturbing thing he had ever seen in his professional life. Nick was in the bedroom. He was in a seated or semi-standing position, propped between a wall and the frame of a piece of furniture. He was fully dressed, including his boots. His eyes were open. He appeared from a distance to be conscious. He was not conscious. He had been dead for a number of hours by the time Roeder arrived. The police came. The paramedics came. A doctor came. The scene, as it was described in the reports later filed, was orderly. There was no sign of a struggle. There was no sign of forced entry. There was no note. There was no obvious injury. There was a man in a bedroom, sitting upright against the wall in his clothes, in the middle of an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, dead. The body was taken to the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office. The autopsy was performed under the supervision of Dr. Thomas Noguchi, who was, at that period, the chief medical examiner for the county, and who was already, by 1968, well on his way to becoming one of the most famous forensic pathologists in the world. He is the same Dr. Noguchi who had autopsied Marilyn Monroe 6 years earlier, and who would later autopsy Robert Kennedy, Sharon Tate, and many others. If you were a Los Angeles celebrity in the 1960s and something happened to you, Thomas Noguchi was likely the man who was going to try to figure out what. The toxicology results, when they came back, showed the presence of several substances in Nick Adams's bloodstream. The primary finding was paraldehyde, which is a sedative that was, in that era, sometimes prescribed for the treatment of alcohol withdrawal and certain kinds of anxiety. Along with the paraldehyde, there were traces of other central nervous system depressants. The combination was, in the language of the coroner's report, sufficient to have caused death. But here is where the mystery, the real mystery, the one that has never been resolved, begins. Because Dr. Noguchi's office did not rule the death an accident, and it did not rule it a suicide. It ruled the manner of death, in the specific language on the certificate, undetermined. Undetermined. On the death certificate of a working Hollywood actor in the middle of one of the most famous forensic offices in the country, run by one of the most careful forensic scientists of his generation. Undetermined. And that word, that single word on that single piece of paper, has haunted the case of Nick Adams for more than 50 years. To understand why that word, undetermined, matters so much, we need to talk for a moment about how coroners work, and specifically how a coroner as experienced as Thomas Noguchi worked. Because undetermined is not a shrug. Undetermined is not, we did not bother to figure it out. Undetermined is a specific technical ruling that a medical examiner makes when the physical evidence is not consistent enough with any single manner of death to allow a confident finding. It is, in effect, the coroner saying, on the official record, "I know how this man died biologically. I know what was in his blood, but I cannot tell you, based on the scene and the evidence, whether it was an accident, a suicide, or something else." There were, in the case of Nick Adams, specific things about the scene that did not fit neatly into any one category. Let us go through them, one at a time, calmly and carefully, the way an investigator would. First, the position of the body. Nick was found sitting upright, propped against a wall, fully dressed, wearing his boots. That is an unusual final position for a person who has taken a fatal dose of sedatives, whether accidentally or on purpose. In the overwhelming majority of overdose deaths, whether accidental or self-inflicted, the person becomes drowsy, lies down, and dies in a position of rest, on a bed, on a couch, on the floor. Sitting upright, in shoes, in an alert-looking posture, is not what a person taking a sedative typically does in their last conscious moments. Second, the absence of the immediate paraphernalia. According to reports of the scene, no pill bottle, no syringe, no container of paraldehyde was found in a position that clearly matched the manner in which the substances had been consumed. Paraldehyde, in particular, is a liquid with a very strong, distinctive smell. Anyone who has ever encountered it in a medical setting will tell you it has a scent that is impossible to miss. It was not the kind of substance one would casually swallow without water, without a glass, without something obviously in the room to have taken it from. The exact details of what was and was not found at the scene have been debated over the years, but the general observation, made by more than one person involved in the case at the time, was that the scene did not look, at first glance, like a typical self-administered overdose. Third, the absence of a note. A note is not required for a suicide ruling. Plenty of confirmed suicides leave no note. But the combination of no note, no clear pill container, and the unusual body position, taken together, made it harder for the coroner's office to feel confident in a suicide finding. Fourth, Nick's own recent behavior. He had, according to friends and business associates, been talking about future plans in the days leading up to his death. He had upcoming meetings. He had, as we mentioned, a lawyer arriving that very morning about a business matter. He had expressed to more than one person that he was expecting money to come in. He was, by his outward behavior in the final week of his life, a man who was planning to still be alive next Tuesday. That, again, does not rule out suicide. People who plan for the future can still, in a moment of despair, take their own lives. But it is a data point. It is one more thing that did not cleanly fit. Fifth, the paraldehyde itself. This is a detail that requires a little context. In 1968, paraldehyde was not a street drug. It was not a recreational substance. It was a specific pharmaceutical, administered in specific medical settings, typically for very specific reasons. If Nick Adams had paraldehyde in his system in a quantity sufficient to contribute to his death, that raised an immediate question. Where did it come from? Who prescribed it? And why? Those questions were, at the time, pursued to some extent by investigators, but they were never, in a fully public way, resolved. Add all of those factors together, and you begin to understand why the coroner did what he did. Faced with a scene that was not clean, a body position that was strange, an absence of clear paraphernalia, no note, a decedent who had been talking about the future, and a substance whose presence itself raised follow-up questions, Dr. Noguchi's office wrote, "Undetermined." Not because the office was hiding something, but because, on the honest reading of what was in front of them, they did not have enough evidence to commit to any one manner of death. Now, into the space left by that word, undetermined, a whole generation of speculation has poured over the last 50 years. And I want to walk through those theories with you carefully, because some of them are more grounded than others, and I think it is only fair to you to be honest about which is which. The first theory, the simplest one, and the one that most sober biographers of Nick Adams have tended to lean toward, is accidental overdose. In this reading, Nick had been struggling with sleep, anxiety, and possibly alcohol use in the difficult months of the divorce. He had access somehow to prescription sedatives. On the evening or night before his death, he took a combination of substances, probably some combination of paraldehyde and other depressants, in an attempt to sleep or to calm his mind, or simply to get through another difficult night in an empty rented house. The combination, in the amounts he took, was more than his body could handle. He did not intend to die. He died anyway. The unusual body position in this reading is explained by the possibility that he sat down on the floor, perhaps feeling unwell, and lost consciousness before he could lie down properly. It is a plausible, sad, ordinary explanation. And of the various theories, it is probably the one that the greatest number of careful researchers over the decades have found most consistent with the actual evidence. The second theory is suicide. In this reading, Nick had reached, in the loneliness of the separation, in the disappointment of a career that had not quite lifted the way he had hoped, in the accumulated exhaustion of 2 decades of striving, a private breaking point. He took the pills deliberately. He did not leave a note because he did not want to, or could not bring himself to, or was, in his final hours, simply not in a state to write one. The strange body position is explained as the final act of a man who did not want to be found lying down like a broken thing, who chose, in a last small piece of stagecraft, to be found sitting up. This theory is also, in fairness, plausible. Some people who knew Nick in his last months have said, in later interviews, that they saw signs of a level of despair that would be consistent with such an outcome. Others have said they saw no such signs at all. The third theory is the one that has, over the years, generated the most heat. The theory of foul play. That someone else was involved. That Nick Adams did not die alone, unwatched from his own actions. That some other person, for some other reason, either directly caused his death or was present when it occurred and left the scene arranged in a specific way afterwards. Now, I want to be extremely careful here, because this is exactly the kind of territory where irresponsible storytelling can do real damage, both to the memory of a man who cannot defend himself and to the intelligence of the audience listening. So I am going to lay out the foul play theory in the most honest way I can, and I'm going to tell you clearly what is documented and what is not. What is documented is this. The scene, as we have discussed, contained anomalies. The body position was unusual. The paraphernalia consistent with self-administration was not obviously present at the scene. The autopsy left the manner of death officially undetermined. Some individuals close to Nick, including at various points members of his own family, have said publicly that they did not believe he took his own life, and did not believe he died by accident either. His mother, Catherine, went to her own grave believing that her son had not died by his own hand. His brother, Andrew, expressed similar doubts in interviews given years afterward. These are real, on-the-record family beliefs. I am not inventing them. What is not documented is any specific, evidence-supported identification of any other person as being responsible for his death. No suspect was ever named by police. No arrest was ever made. No public prosecutor ever presented to any grand jury any case suggesting that another human being had caused Nick Adams's death. The various theories about who might have been involved and why, theories involving Hollywood insiders, theories involving the supposed tell-all book, theories involving personal enemies, theories involving business disputes, are exactly that. Theories. They are, in the strictest sense, speculation. They have never been substantiated in any court, in any official investigation, or in any confirmed documentary source. I want to say this out loud, and I want to say it clearly because it matters. There is no publicly proven evidence that Nick Adams was murdered. What exists is a set of unusual circumstances, a coroner's ruling of undetermined, and the honest, human, understandable refusal of some people who loved him to accept either of the two more ordinary explanations. That is not the same thing as proof. And you, as someone listening carefully to this story, deserve to know the difference. What we can say, with confidence, is that whatever happened in that bedroom on the 7th of February 1968, we do not fully know. And we may never fully know. The people who were there, if there was anyone there other than Nick, are gone. The people who might have known something have died. The paperwork that survives is what we have, and the paperwork ends with that single, quiet word: undetermined. Now, let us leave the mystery for a moment, and let us return to the family. Because in some ways, the aftermath of Nick Adams's death is the part of the story that gets talked about the least. And it is, in its own way, the most important part. Carol Nugent was, on the morning of the 7th of February, at her own home with the children. The divorce, as we said, was in progress, but not final. She was, in the strict legal sense at that moment, still Nick Adams's wife. When the news came, she had to do two things almost simultaneously. She had to absorb the fact that the man she had loved, married, had children with, argued with, tried to save, and finally decided she could not save, was dead. And she had to figure out how to tell a 7-year-old girl and a 6-year-old boy that their father was not coming back. There is no manual for that. There has never been. Every parent who has ever had to sit down with a small child and explain a death of that magnitude has had to invent, in the moment, the words for something that cannot really be put into words. Carol did it. What she said and how she said it is not part of the public record, and that is exactly as it should be. What is part of the record is what she did afterwards. She raised those children. Allison and Jeb grew up. They had lives. They had, by every account, a mother who protected them, who told them the truth about their father in the measures they could handle at each age, and who never, in the long decades afterwards, allowed either the tabloids or the theorists to define who Nick Adams had been to them. Carol herself, in the years and decades after Nick's death, largely stepped away from Hollywood. She had never been fully consumed by it in the way Nick had been, and after his death she chose, quietly, a smaller and more private life. She gave a small number of interviews over the years. In those interviews she was, without exception, careful. She did not sensationalize. She did not condemn. She spoke of Nick as a complicated, gifted, sometimes difficult, sometimes wonderful man whom she had loved. She did not pretend the marriage had been easy. She did not pretend it had been ruined. She told, as best she could, the truth as she remembered it, which is really all any of us can ever do. Nick's parents, Peter and Catherine, outlived their son. That is one of the corrections we owe to the record, because in some tellings of the Nick Adams story, it is sometimes suggested that his father had died before him. That is not accurate. Peter Adamshock lived on after Nick's death. So did Catherine. They carried the loss of their son, as parents in every generation and every country have carried the loss of children, quietly and every day. Catherine, as we mentioned, never accepted the more ordinary explanations of his death. She believed, until the end of her own life, that something else had happened in that bedroom. Whether she was right or wrong, we do not and cannot know. But her belief itself is part of the record, and it is part of the reason the Nick Adams case has never fully closed in the public imagination. Nick's younger brother, Andrew, kept the family memory alive in his own way. He spoke at various points over the years to journalists and biographers who came asking. He described a big brother who was fiercely protective, sometimes hard, often generous, and always working. He described a man who had, from the smallest age, wanted to be somebody, and who had, in the end, been somebody, and who had, in the exact moment of being somebody, been taken from them. The funeral was held in Los Angeles. Nick was buried at the Saints Cyril and Methodius Ukrainian Catholic Cemetery in Berwick, Pennsylvania, in the coal region close to where he had begun. There is a certain terrible symmetry in that. The boy who had ridden a Greyhound bus westward at the age of 18, who had made himself into a Hollywood name, who had stood inside the auditorium at the Academy Awards, who had traveled to Tokyo and been treated as a star, was carried, in the end, back to the small Pennsylvania town near where his father's coal-stained hands had once held him as an infant. He is there still. If you were, for whatever reason, to visit the area today, you could go and stand at the grave and read the name on the stone and think about the whole shape of the life that connects that name to that patch of Pennsylvania ground. And that would be one kind of ending to the story, a quiet one. A grave in a small town, a family carrying on, a widow raising the children, a brother giving the occasional interview, a mother, until the end of her life, not believing the official version. But there is another part of the story that we have not yet fully explored, and I would be cheating you if I did not tell it now. Because Nick Adams's life did not exist in isolation. He had other friends, other connections, other loyalties. And one of those friends was one of the most famous human beings on the planet, a man whose own death, less than a decade later, would itself become one of the great American mysteries. That man's name was Elvis Presley. And what Elvis Presley and Nick Adams meant to each other, in the years when they knew each other, is, in some ways, the last important piece of the Nick Adams story. Because that friendship, too, has been mythologized. That friendship, too, has been the subject of decades of speculation. And that friendship, too, deserves to be told as honestly as we know how to tell it. The friendship between Nick Adams and Elvis Presley began in 1956. If you want to fix the year in your mind, that is the year Elvis exploded across America. That is the year of Heartbreak Hotel. That is the year of the Ed Sullivan Show appearances. That is the year the world found out that a young man from Tupelo, Mississippi could stand on a stage and change what music meant in America. And it is also the year Elvis Presley came to Hollywood, for the first time, to make his first motion picture. That picture was called Love Me Tender, released in November of 1956. Elvis was, when he arrived, 21 years old. He was, by every account of the people who met him then, both enormously famous and, in a strange, private way, quite shy. He was a young man from a very specific kind of Southern background, dropped into the middle of the most sophisticated and cynical film industry in the world, and he did not at first quite know how to navigate it. He needed friends. He needed people who could show him around. He needed, more than anything, people close to his own age who understood the industry from the inside, but who would treat him as a person rather than as a phenomenon. Nick Adams was, at that moment, exactly that kind of person. He was 25 years old. He had been in Los Angeles for about 6 years. He knew every corner of the town. He knew which restaurants stayed open late. He knew which producers to be careful of and which ones were honest. He was, in a way, one of the natural welcoming committees of 1956 Hollywood. An unmarried young working actor with time on his hands and an interest in every new arrival. They met, by most accounts, on the set or in the general orbit of Love Me Tender. And they clicked, in the way that certain kinds of young men, thrown together in the peculiar pressure cooker of the film industry, sometimes do. They started spending time together. They went to restaurants. They went to nightclubs. They went, in a story that Nick himself later told, on drives up into the Hollywood Hills at 3 o'clock in the morning, just to sit and look down at the lights of Los Angeles and talk about their lives. For a period of a few years in the late 1950s, Nick Adams was, without question, one of the closer friends Elvis Presley had in Hollywood. He was part of what would later, in Elvis's world, become known informally as the Memphis Mafia, though Nick was obviously not from Memphis and not part of that inner circle in the way the Southern boys around Elvis were. Nick was, more accurately, one of the Hollywood satellites of that circle, one of the local friends whom Elvis kept in touch with when he was in town. There are photographs of them together from that period. If you have never seen them, they are worth finding. In those photographs, both men look very young. They look, in some of them, almost like brothers. They are dressed sharply, in the style of 1956 and 1957 Los Angeles. They are smiling in a way that men in their 20s smile when they know, for a little while, that the world is treating them well. The friendship changed shape when Elvis was drafted into the United States Army in 1958. Elvis went off to serve. He was, for a long stretch, stationed overseas in Germany. Nick continued his own career in Los Angeles. They stayed in touch, though not in those years as constantly as they had been. When Elvis came back from the Army in 1960, the world had changed. Nick was by then married to Carol. He was starring in The Rebel. He had a life that no longer had the same time in it for 3 o'clock in the morning drives up into the hills. And Elvis, meanwhile, was moving into the phase of his career defined by an almost endless string of formulaic Hollywood musicals. The two friends saw less of each other, not because of any falling out, simply because their lives had, in the way that lives do, drifted into different rooms. But the friendship never fully ended. They stayed in occasional touch through the middle 1960s, and when Nick died, in February of 1968, Elvis Presley was reportedly deeply affected. According to accounts that have circulated in Elvis biographies over the years, he was informed of Nick's death shortly after it occurred, and he was, by those accounts, badly shaken. Some sources say he sent flowers. Some sources say he did more than that. What is undisputed is that a man who had by 1968 seen a great deal of loss in his life, his mother in 1958, his own private disappointments over the trajectory of his career, the darker turns of the decade, took the news of Nick Adams's death very personally. Now, because we are being honest with each other, I want to say the following out loud. There has been speculation, in various tabloid-style biographies over the decades, about the exact nature of the closeness between Nick Adams and Elvis Presley. Some writers have suggested there was a romantic dimension. There is no confirmed evidence of this. Not a letter, not a photograph. Not a first-person on-the-record account from anyone who was actually present in their private lives. Elvis Presley's romantic life with women is, by contrast, one of the most exhaustively documented private lives of any 20th century celebrity. So when you hear the whisper that the friendship between Nick and Elvis was something other than a friendship, I need you to understand that this is, again, speculation, and it is not something I am going to present to you as established fact. What I can tell you is that they were friends, that they were, at one point, close friends, that when one of them died, the other one mourned. That is what the record supports. Everything past that, in my honest view, belongs to gossip. And gossip is not what you came here for. There is one more thing about the Elvis connection that is worth telling, because it says something about who Nick Adams was as a person. In the years when they were closest, Nick had opportunities to publicly cash in on the friendship. He could have given tell-all interviews. He could have sold stories about Elvis to the fan magazines that would have paid him well for them. Nick was, as we have discussed, not above using his connections to advance his own career. He had done exactly that with James Dean. But with Elvis, in the years when they were friends, Nick did not do it. He gave, over the course of the whole friendship, only a small number of respectful interviews about Elvis, and he never, in any documented case, betrayed a private confidence. That is a small thing. But in the industry Nick Adams worked in, a small thing like that is not actually small at all. It is a real piece of evidence about the kind of man he could be when he chose to be that kind of man. So, let us pull back now for a moment and try to see the whole picture. Because we have covered a lot of ground together, and I want to make sure that when you close this story in your mind, you close it with the right shape of the whole life, not just the shape of the ending. A boy is born in a coal town in Pennsylvania in 1931. His father goes into the ground every day. His mother holds the small house together. The boy is a natural performer from the age of 6 or 7. His family moves to Jersey City when he is around 10. He grows up in the shadow of New York City, watching movies, practicing faces in a mirror. At 18, he gets on a bus and rides across America. He arrives in Los Angeles with almost nothing. He works odd jobs. He gets his first small screen credit in 1952. He serves in the Coast Guard during Korea. He comes back. He becomes a Warner Brothers contract player. He befriends James Dean. He appears in Rebel Without a Cause. Dean dies. He mourns. He works. He appears in some of the biggest films of the middle 1950s in small but real roles. He befriends Elvis Presley. He stars in a television western called The Revel for 2 seasons. He marries Carol Nugent. They have 2 children. He is nominated for an Academy Award in 1963. He does not win. He travels to Japan to work with Toho. He struggles in the middle 1960s with a career that has not quite risen to where he thought it would go. His marriage strains and finally breaks. In early February of 1968, he is found dead in the bedroom of his rented house in Beverly Hills, in a position that has never been fully explained, from a combination of substances whose exact route into his body has never been fully accounted for, in a case that the coroner's office, in the end, was unable to close with confidence. That is the outline. That is the shape of the life. But it is not, I would argue, the meaning of the life. The meaning of the life, if I can be permitted to say so, is not in the mystery of the death. The meaning of the life is in the striving. It is in the boy in the church nativity play who forgot his line and refused to freeze. It is in the 18-year-old on the Greyhound bus, watching America unroll backwards through a dirty window, going somewhere he had never been because he believed he was supposed to be there. It is in the young man at the small edge table of the Warner Brothers commissary, waiting for the phone call that might change everything. It is in the man on the Rebel set, riding a horse across a dusty California landscape while Johnny Cash's voice announced, week after week, that he was somebody now. It is in the father in the small house in the valley, on the floor of the living room, letting his son climb across his back on a Sunday afternoon. Those are the images, I think, that deserve to be the images of Nick Adams, not the coroner's ruling. Not the whispered theories, not the paperwork. The living pictures of a man who wanted all his life to be seen, and who was seen, briefly and imperfectly, and not always in the way he had hoped, but seen. He was 36 years old when he died. That is a young age. It is younger than a lot of the people watching or listening to this right now. He had, if things had gone differently, another 30 or 40 or 50 years in him. He might have done character work, the way so many young leading men of his era eventually settled into character work. He might have written that book, if it was ever going to be more than an idea. He might have watched his children grow up, and his grandchildren, and been the kind of grandfather who tells stories about James Dean and Elvis Presley in the backyard on summer evenings. He did not get to do those things. That was, in the strictest sense, the tragedy of his ending. Not the mystery of how it happened, but the simple, ordinary human fact that it happened at all, and that it happened too soon. Nick Adams's grave is in the Saints Cyril and Methodius Ukrainian Catholic Cemetery in Berwick, Pennsylvania, in the coal region where he had begun. If you go there, you will find it. The stone is not extravagant. It is not designed to catch the attention of tourists. It is a stone in a small cemetery in a small town in the coal region of Pennsylvania. And if you did not know who was buried under it, you might walk past it without noticing. But if you do know, and you stop, and you stand there for a moment, you can feel, if you let yourself, the whole shape of the American 20th century pressing into that one small piece of ground. The immigration, the coal mines, the ambition, the bus ride west, the movies, the television, the friends who became legends, the marriages, the disappointments, the small children, the empty rented house, the coroner's word, undetermined, and finally, the trip back to Pennsylvania, back to where he had begun. That, in the end, is the story of Nick Adams. And I hope if you have come with me all the way to the end of it, that you feel now the way I do about him, which is that he was neither a saint nor a scandal. He was neither a martyr nor a mystery. He was a working man in a difficult profession, in a difficult town, in a difficult century, who tried very hard for a long time to be somebody, and who, for a little while, was. If you want to see him now, you can. His films are still there. The Rebel is still watchable. Rebel Without a Cause is still shown on television every year around the anniversary of James Dean's death. Twilight of Honor, the film that got him the Academy Award nomination, still exists. His guest appearances on the classic television series of the late 50s and early 60s, if you dig, you will find them. The Japanese kaiju films with him in the middle of them are still in circulation among fans of that genre. He is not lost, his face is preserved, his voice is preserved. He is, in a very literal way, still here whenever anyone chooses to press play. And that, I think, is the last honest thing to say about him. That the boy from the coal town, who had spent his whole life trying to be seen, is more than 50 years after his death still being seen. In pieces, in fragments, in old films watched on quiet Sunday afternoons by people who happen upon them. In documentaries, in articles, in stories like this one. He is still, in that quiet way, being watched. Which is, if you think about it, exactly what he had asked for from the world, all the way back on the wooden stage of that small church in Nanticoke when he was 6 years old and forgot his line and refused to leave the stage. He wanted to be seen, and we are, right now, still seeing him. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. Thank you for being the kind of listener who wanted the honest version rather than the sensational one. And thank you, most of all, for spending a little time today with a man who, wherever he is now, I think would be very glad to know that on some ordinary afternoon, more than half a century after he was found in that quiet bedroom in Beverly Hills, someone, somewhere, was still saying his name out loud. His name was Nick Adams. And now you know his story.